So they get a finger in both political parties, and they've obviously got some influence over the media and the Justice Department if they're sending Justice Department people out to suppress criminal investigations. That was the implication of something else that you said in Sable's case.
There are attorneys within the intelligence community, in the Pentagon and the CIA, who have been what they refer to as sheep-dipped. They have them resign from their service, but maintain a reserve affiliation either with the Pentagon or a backdoor connection to the agency as an attorney, and then they, through political connections, move them into the Justice Department.
Would the former Attorney General, I think William Barr was his name?
He was a CIA officer,
right.
Yes.
Would he be that kind of an example of that kind of a person?
He would be one that is more obvious. The Assistant Attorney General of the United States who came out to California to shut down the Sable investigation was a reserve Marine Corps colonel that they recruited years ago and had him get out and get into the Justice Department so they could network covert operations inside the justice system of the United States.
It'd be a lot harder to know that he had a CIA connection.
They're damage control people that can shut down investigations that get too close to the covert operators.
Right. And all this is to do what? To protect arms shipments, or to make money, or?
Well, it's a little more complex than that. This goes back into the mid-'70s when they had the major scandals involving CIA officer Ed Wilson when George Bush was CIA director and General Vernon Walters was his deputy and Ted Shackley was the DDO, the Deputy Director of Operations. They had a major scandal of Ed Wilson training Colonel Gaddafi's terrorists in Libya with U.S. Special Forces, NCOs.
Right.
And he shipped 40,000 pounds of C4 explosives over there on a DC-8 out of Houston, Texas. And when it started becoming public knowledge, and it only started after September of '76, after the assassination of Orlando Letelier, the Chilean diplomat in exile in Washington, D.C., after that it started becoming public knowledge, and Bob Woodward started writing some articles in the Washington Post. And so they decided to cut their ties with Ed Wilson and make him go down the tubes as a Lone Ranger, having moved all of this military equipment and people, massive amounts on covert airplanes to Libya. And as a result of that, the scandal grew so big that in 1977 there was an event called the Halloween Massacre between October and December '77, where CIA Director Stansfield Turner saw that the covert operators were totally out of control, and
fired about 800.
Fired over 800 of them, forced them either to resign, retire, or be prosecuted. And Ted Shackley and Tom Clines and General Secord and former Assistant Secretary of Defense
all these folks whose names we've heard from Iran-Contra.
They were all caught up in the scandal and had to quit. And they felt that they were the true secret police patriots of the world, and that Ted Shackley had planned on becoming the next Director of Central Intelligence after Bush if Jerry Ford won the election. And they felt that they had been betrayed by their country, so they decided that the country and the Constitution and the Congress was their enemy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we're going to get back to the macro scale. I want to point out that some of these folks go back a long way, like Ted Shackley, you mentioned. He was involved in Southeast Asia during Vietnam, right?
Yes.
And some of them go back as far as the OSS, I guess, Richard Helms and Bill Colby.
Right, and Bill Casey.
Right.
And I became a trusted insider with these people, but over a period of time, you don't learn this stuff in one day, but over a period of years, it evolved that these guys had taken over the government. After Shackley and Clines and Carlucci and Secord and all those guys were fired from the government, they decided that since the government was their enemy, they better infiltrate it and take it over. So what they did was simply stated that we're trained to install generals and dictators and people under the control of the covert operators in governments in Central and South America and Southeast Asia and the Philippines. They said, why don't we use our expertise around the world to focus in on the United States and treat the United States like the world's biggest banana republic and take it over? And they used those exact words, treat the United States like the world's biggest banana republic and take it over. And the first thing they had to do was get covert operator George Bush, former CIA director, in the White House. So between 1979 and 81, they started funneling shoeboxes full of money into congressmen's campaign coffers. If they wouldn't accept the money, they got them compromised with women on sex. Sex, bribery, and threats of assassination are the key tools of the covert operatives. They call it their tradecraft.
Don't lose your train of thought. I want to interrupt briefly because, you know, I can imagine people in our audience don't know going, this is too much. They took over our government. And yet I want to reaffirm what you're saying. You're telling us things that you saw. And I want to ask just one detailed question, and then you get back on describing the course of events. We talked to Jim Rothstein, whom you know, a retired New York City detective, about compromise operations in particular. And he was talking about the use of children, not just adult women, to compromise politicians, but the use and abuse of children. Did you ever encounter any of that in your experience?
I did on the edges of it. I would love to name the man, but there is a very prominent man in Washington, D.C., very prominent, who was on the board of directors of some of Ed Wilson's front companies, was a personal friend of his and George Bush's, who used to furnish page boys to dirty old senators to do sexual favors for.
Well, let's not go down that road because we have covered it and it's quite a distraction from the main point, which is the arrogation of secret power to the point where they can actually talk about taking over the government and continue running drugs and guns around the world, even though we've all had Iran-Contra hearings. Did that stop all this or not?
That never even put a dent in it. In fact, it let it run freer after that because everybody stopped looking. And in a way, the Iran-Contra hearings, which were a major cover-up, were a favor to these guys because the American public and the media and the Congress were burnt out on the hearings in the Iran-Contra, and they assumed they went away after that. They didn't even slow down. They're going heavier now than they were then, yes. And they're selling weapons to our enemies as well as our friends and moving huge amounts, billions of dollars worth of money around the world. They have attorneys with front companies who are investing this money in high-tech industry in the United States. They're buying into the media, to the umbrella corporations that own the national media, into the aerospace and defense industry and the telecommunications industry, through front men, not so they have majority ownership, but so that they have enough ownership of stock in these corporations that they are a single block of stock owners who can place people on the board of directors of these corporations. These guys have bribed and blackmailed so many congressmen that all of these congressmen that you see and senators who are no longer running for election, most of them are burnt out because they have been blackmailed and threatened for so many years that they either have to continue to compromise their integrity for the rest of their lives or leave U.S. government service.
And that's a very serious proposition because theoretically the Congress is overseeing all this for today. You sat in on a meeting involving these folks that had to do with militia topics, and could you just characterize that briefly and we'll go on with that?
Yes, in the mid-'80s I was listening to the covert operators in Washington, D.C. talk about how jealous they were of the KGB having domestic police and secret police powers in the Soviet Union, and they wanted those powers in America. And they decided one way to get that was to create or infiltrate patriotic militia movements in America and cause disruption and controversy and clash between ethnic groups and racial groups in the United States so that we would give up some of our constitutional rights and they could take over.
Well, thank you for today, Gene, and we're just going to do a second tape with you because these topics are too important and too complicated to be dealt with in just 28 minutes. So thank you all for tuning in to Rethinking the World, and we'll see you again soon, I hope.